So, welcome to all our visitors this morning. Marvellous to see so many young people here. I hope that what I'm going to say, firstly, will be what the Lord wants us to hear. Secondly, it's going to be interesting. And thirdly, it might provoke some thoughts. So a few things before we start. Now, the West End congregation know who I am, but I thought a couple of biographical notes would be a good idea. I've been a Christian for about 50 years, which makes me extremely old. I've been married to Rosemary for about 45 years. That's the beautiful woman sitting over there. Okay? And that's the good news. Okay? Now the bad news. The bad news is I've also been a physicist for 50 years. My day job is a physics professor with a very fancy title at Dalhousie University. And if you ever want to stop a conversation at a party, try announcing that you teach physics and see what happens to you. So why am I telling you all this? Well, there's a rumor around that you can't be a Christian and a scientist at the same time or your head's going to explode. Well, if you can look at my head carefully, okay, there's less hair on it than there used to be, but there are no signs of stress fractures, and there's no imminent explosion. It can be done. Okay? The other thing I want to say is that this sermon, like some others that I've given, tends to veer on the practical side, and so I may start walking across some people's corns with some of my examples. So it's not my intention to antagonize, and I apologize for that in advance, but unless our Christian faith is deep down and dirty in our lives, then it has no reality. As my namesake James put it, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Works, the things we do every day, our lifestyle choice, is faith in action. I also want to talk about an area that has room for interpretation. So my decisions may not be your decisions, and yet we can both be right. The aim of this talk is to get us thinking about how we live our lives, not give a prescribed solution. So the question is, how then shall we live? Christian living in the world is not easy. We have to decide what's right and what's wrong, and further, what's right for me and what's wrong for me. And sometimes, well, as Charlie Brown once put it, sometimes I lie awake at night and I ask, is life a multiple choice test, or is it a true or false test? Then a voice comes to me out of the dark and says, we hate to tell you this, but life is a 1,000-word essay. But we have to live. There's no alternative. When we're young, our lifestyle is determined for us. You are going to youth group. But as we get older, we make our own decisions. And as adults, we get to decide every day how we will live from now until the day we die. Now, the largest decision that you will make in your life is whether to follow Christ or not. You will make this choice. You cannot avoid it. And this is a decision that you have to make for yourself. Your parents cannot make it for you. Your pastor cannot make it for you. Your friends cannot make it for you. This has to be your decision, and it is always a pivotal one. Whether it comes gradually or in a big rush is less relevant than realizing that it is the most important decision you will ever make because it has eternal consequences. Now, I hope that all of you have made that decision. In the words of the hymn, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. If you haven't, then this sermon is nowhere near as important as getting that sorted out. And if you want to work on that, feel free to leave now, and please talk to somebody you trust about it. Or you can hang around after the service and grab someone then. But there are a lot of other choices in life. What career shall I follow? Who will be my life partner? Should I drink coffee, alcohol, smoke marijuana? Remember, it's going to be legal next year. Get a tattoo, buy a new jacket, have an Instagram account, buy a motorcycle. move to Halifax. And in case the older generation feel they're left out, shall I downsize? Buy a motorcycle? Retire? Give up the car? As Christians, how do we make these decisions correctly? Popular theory is, well, you read the Bible and you pray about it. It has the virtue of being perfectly correct, but nowhere near complete. I'm going to suggest today that we need to scope out the territory so that our choices are the right ones and the best for us. And just to make it clear, that doesn't absolve us from reading the Bible and praying it through. The fact is that Christianity has few rules. Within broad limits, there's no requirement on what we wear, no requirement on how many times we pray, which direction we face, no requirements on how we talk. In fact, Jesus left us with very few rules, but, and it's a huge but, the few rules we do have immense ramifications. When Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. If you think having a few rules makes life easy, think again. Those are pretty all-encompassing. There's also the issue of whether we should do something, even if we could do it. Listen to Paul in Corinthians chapter 6. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. So what are the best practices for Christian living? I would say the most important thing, besides prayer and Bible reading, is that we should work things through before they become critical. The decision of whether to smoke marijuana should not be made when someone is offering you a joint. If you think ahead and anticipate, then you get a chance to think and discuss with others in the church community. That's very important, when the urgency is not there. And there's a whole science behind that which says you make better decisions when you do that, which I don't have time to go into here. Then there are three critical questions which, unless you're prepared to miss lunch, I'm going to have to go through very briefly. The first one, how will this affect my relationship with Christ? As a Christian, I volunteered to follow Christ, so anything that gets in the way of that is not a viable option. Let's take a concrete example. If praying on Saturday night is going to mean that you can't participate in church activities on Sunday morning, then that needs thought. In Hebrews 10, the writer encourages us not to give up meeting together, as is some are in the habit of doing. The Bible regards the community, sorry about sipping water, I'm clearing up a cold. The Bible regards the community, the church, as very important in our lives. And from my observation, I'd agree with that. So in that case, the answer is pretty simple. At least limit your partying on Saturday night to give priority to church activities on Sunday morning. But what if that isn't an option? It's not a party, it's my job. And I have to work Sundays, and I have to have a job or I don't eat. Well, you'll have to think things through. How do I do this while maintaining my relationship with Christ? Can I do this while maintaining my relationship with Christ? What might I have to do, and what might I have to give up in order to maintain the relationship? First priority, and keep my job. Perhaps you can negotiate some Sundays off with the boss. Perhaps you can find a church community that meets during the week. Perhaps you could attend an early morning group, even if it means going to bed early the night before. Perhaps you need another job. Your lifestyle choices should reinforce your relationship with Christ, not tear it down. Let me introduce you to Pam. Pam's become a Christian, but she realizes that she's got a problem. She's been in the habit of drinking, and she knows that in her family there are a number of heavy drinkers. Some of them might be alcoholics. She knows she has problems limiting her drinking. And she also knows that her drinking is getting in the way of her relationship with Christ. She discusses this with her growth group, and even though she can find nothing in the Bible against drinking, there's plenty against drunkenness, she decides to give it up, despite the problems that's going to cause her socially. If you think about these issues and plan ahead before the situation gets critical, then your chances of success are much higher. I don't have a scripture for that, but I think it's common sense. Second question. First question, remember, how will this affect my relationship with Christ? Second question, how will I affect the community of believers? The Bible identifies the church, the community of believers, as an essential component of our Christian walk. So anything that affects us affects them, and vice versa. That's why it's a good idea to involve the community in your decisions, just as Pam did. And this is a key role for small groups in the life of the church. But your lifestyle choices may not fit with your church's expectations. Churches have rules. Some churches have a lot of rules. An elder in a church I once attended told me that when he was young, if he and his wife wanted to go to a movie, they went to the next town so that no one from their church would see them. Some rules are good, and some aren't. But we might well look behind the rules, at the reasons for the rules, to see what the thinking is. We may not agree, but we should understand. Here's a real example that I had occasion to look into recently. According to Wikipedia, the Old Order Amish tend to restrict telephone use as it is viewed by some as interfering with separation from the world. By bringing the outside world into the home is an intrusion into the privacy and sanctity of the family and interferes with social community by eliminating face-to-face communication. Are the Amish wrong? I won't ask you to raise your hands if you've got a phone. But I give you prosecution exhibit number 1, the smartphone. Is this an intrusion into the privacy and sanctity of the family? How many of you watched a family in the restaurant and they're all on their smartphones? Does it interfere with social community by eliminating face-to-face communication? Would we have so much problem with cyber stalking and cyberbullying in Canada if we forced people to communicate face-to-face? And just to make the point that I'm not being absolutist here, this is my smartphone, okay? You may not agree, but you should make the effort to understand. Or take Pam's decision about alcohol. Many churches frown on alcohol, and that can seem overly restrictive. But consider the health and other risks of alcohol, which are well documented, and you might see the position has merit. The Bible condemns drunkenness, not drinking, and Paul even advised Timothy to take a little wine. But on the other hand, no one in the Bible was in charge of 2 tons of metal with a 50-litre tank of Class 1B flammable liquid in the back, moving at 100 kilometers an hour down the highway on a dark, wet night. Think about that. And, that wasn't bad enough, like it or not, you're a role model to other members of the community. And things that you might be quite happy with, others may find really troubling. How about this from Romans? Romans 14. Accept the one whose faith is weak without quarreling over disputable matters. One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not, and the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them. Now, let's be clear. The reason for not eating meat had nothing to do with modern vegetarianism. The problem was that the meat purchased had often been offered to idols, and some Christians felt that they couldn't have anything to do with that meat, and some tucked into the steak and chips with abandon. The writer of the Romans is saying, make sure that your decisions do not affect somebody else's relationship with Christ. Like it or not, since all we Christians are in this world together, the answer to the question that Cain in Genesis put to God, am I my brother's keeper, is yes. Your lifestyle choices should build up the local church community, not tear it down. Pam has met Dave at her local church. They're very much in love, and they're going to get married. Dave comes from a family of wine connoisseurs. And his parents are elders in the church. But Pam and Dave know that they're going to have some agreement about drinking alcohol. Again, after discussions with the church community and much prayer, they decide to be alcohol-free in their marriage. Question number 1 was, how will this affect my relationship with Christ? Question number 2 was, how will I affect the community? Question number 3, how will I affect the world? So finally, we come to our text. You know I was going to get there sometime. Jesus' disciples fall foul of the local spot it and stop it brigade, also known as the Pharisees, who had a rule for everything and saw the disciples breaking them. You were not allowed to harvest and thresh corn on the Sabbath. So plucking those ears of corn and rubbing them off and blowing off the husk for a quick snack was a no-no. The problem is that if you study the gospel, Jesus and his crew were in a no-win situation. As Jesus himself said in Luke 7, whereunto then shall I liken the men of this generation? And to what are they like? They are like unto children sitting in the marketplace and calling one to another and saying, we have piped unto you, and you have not danced. We have mourned to you, but you have not wept. But John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he's got a devil. The Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and you say, behold, a gluttonous man and a wine-bibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. And by the way, gluttony is habitual greed or excess in eating. And I was thinking, I have never heard a sermon about gluttony in my life. Anybody heard a sermon about gluttony? No, okay, no one, all right. And a publican, those of us from Britain would regard a publican as a person who keeps a public house, a bar. But in those days, a publican was somebody who collected taxes for the Roman occupation. If we live our lives for the world's approval, then we're doomed for many reasons. But Jesus makes an important point at the end of the reading, that the rules about the Sabbath were made for our benefit, not for our slavish obedience. And in the Gospels, we see him breaking with convention time and time again, not so that he could point out that the conventions were bad, he didn't, or to have a good time, but so that the kingdom could be extended. Think of his conversation with the Samaritan woman. He talked to a Samaritan, for goodness sake. He talked to a woman, for goodness sake. Both of those in that society were no-nos. Or his embrace of those publicans, those tax collectors. Zacchaeus was a very little man, and a very little man was he. We need to remember that we may be the only Jesus that some will ever see. And Jesus told his disciples, and by extension ourselves, Matthew 5, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light to all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father within heaven. In Romans 12, we're enjoined, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And Paul tells the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 9, I have become all things to all people, that by all possible means I might save some. Our face to the world should present a positive image of Christ, and one which will attract people to Christ, not push them away. And that's tough to do in a society where people tend to think the worst of Christians. As Pam and Chris are planning their wedding, Pam's family realize, no alcohol! And for them, this is a real downer. So their pastor proposes that although there will be mostly no alcohol at the wedding, the toasts will be drunk in champagne. And that way the drinkers won't feel, in the family, won't feel got at. After due consideration, Pam and Chris agree because they don't want their choices to get in the way of their family relationships, and they can always quietly substitute water or fruit juice for the champagne for anyone who needs it. So it's champagne for the toasts and fruit punch for the rest. So, if I can recap briefly, we should lead good Christian lives that will, 1, positively affect our relationship with Christ, 2, build up the local church community, and 3, show a positive image of Christ to the world around us. And the way to do that is to think about the issues alone and in groups before they become important, and to do all this with Bible reading and prayer. And in case you were wondering, life goes on, and Pam and Chris are happily married and quite active in the church, which is having an evangelism outreach, and so they are getting to know some neighbors. Dave is getting very friendly with John from 2 doors down and hopes to invite him to a church event next month. One evening, John rings up and asks if Dave and Pam want to come over next Wednesday and join him and some friends for the evening. The main aim of the evening is to sample a variety of John's homebrewed beers. The solution of this problem is left as an exercise for the reader.